Now, when we look at it closer, we'll see that the reason is very, very different and has to do with the attitude to holotropic states of consciousness. Because people from the ancient and the pre-industrial cultures systematically used non-ordinary states of consciousness as part of their ritual and spiritual life, so that large numbers of the members of these cultures had repeated first-hand experience of the holotropic realities, and their worldview somehow had to be a synthesis of what they experience in everyday life through the mediation of the senses, and also what they experience in these holotropic states. Whereas we have rejected and pathologized holotropic states, we don't use or even allow some of the means that could induce these states. And when people start having these experiences spontaneously, we find ways of suppressing them. People get labels, people get hospitalized, so that the experiences and the observations from holotropic states cannot find somehow the way into the Western worldview. What I have observed repeatedly, that people from our culture, no matter what their IQ, no matter what their educational background, no matter what their specialization is, when they have the opportunity to have powerful transpersonal experiences, they will not accept what has been referred to as the Cartesian Newtonian materialistic worldview anymore, and their worldview starts shifting in the direction of the great mystical traditions, in the direction of the Eastern spiritual philosophies, and in many instances, even in the direction of the worldview of the native cultures. So somehow, the difference in these two worldviews in relation to the existence or non-existence of the spiritual dimensions really doesn't reflect somehow the superiority of Western materialistic science, but more our own naivete in relation to these non-ordinary states of consciousness and what they have to offer. Now, what we are talking about here is something that has tremendous significance. It's not just a matter of academic interest. It has very, very deep and very serious implications for our everyday life. So it is really essential for us to decide whether the transpersonal vision really reflects an existing dimension of reality, whose practical application of the transpersonal vision could really transform our individual life and have even much larger sort of collective implications. It certainly could provide much more effective ways of healing emotional and psychosomatic disorders and make our life much more satisfying, much more rewarding, open up new sources of creativity, but also provide some strategies that could help us to change the situation in the world. If enough people would pursue this path, this could mean a significant alleviation of the global crisis that we are all facing, and that endangers not only the future of humanity, but possibly even the survival of life on this planet. So these are some of the issues that we'll be exploring in the next sessions. We have now explored at some length the insights from non-ordinary states concerning the dimensions of human consciousness, the model of the human psyche, and we saw that the current understanding that we have in academic psychiatry and psychology is very superficial and incomplete. It doesn't make it possible to understand the kind of experiences and observations that happen when we work with non-ordinary states. And I've tried to outline the vastly expanded cartography that has emerged from this work that we need to deal with the phenomena that we observe. And I mentioned that besides the biographical realm and the Freudian individual unconscious, we have to add these two new domains, the perinatal, which is related to the trauma of birth and to the process of psychospiritual transformation, the process of death, rebirth, and then the vast domain that we now call transpersonal. And we'll now look at the new understanding that also emerged out of this work of what we can call architecture or geometry of emotional and psychosomatic disorders, or something that's conventionally called psychopathology or abnormal psychology. The field of psychiatry basically is dominated by the medical model. You can see it already from the terms that we are using: psychopathology, emotional disorders, mental disease, and the fact that we relate to people who have these kinds of difficulties as patients. Now, historically, the fact that psychiatry became a subspecialty of medicine has its origin in the last century, where there was tremendous progress of a variety of disciplines: microscopy, laboratory techniques, pathological anatomy, microbiology, and so on. And at a certain point, these new techniques were also applied in psychiatric facilities, particularly in the locked wards, with the hope that somehow this will provide some kind of clues for the understanding of these disorders. And actually, initially, there were some successes. There were conditions where the researchers could find some biological, some organic basis in the form of infections, in the form of some degenerative diseases, in the form of some vascular diseases. But the success was really relatively limited. The longer the researchers continued, the less they were finding, until it became clear that the vast majority of psychiatric patients really does not show any very clear medical conditions that would account somehow for the psychological changes. And this was a major impetus for the development of another line of research, which was basically an attempt at psychological understanding of these disorders. And historically, this is linked particularly with one person, with Sigmund Freud, who almost single-handedly laid the foundations for depth psychology, as it is called now. He basically discovered the dynamics of the unconscious. He gave the interpretation of the symbolism of the neurotic symptoms, suggested how we can interpret dreams, discovered the importance of traumas in infancy or childhood for the development of emotional disorders, brought in insights into such areas as what he called psychopathology of everyday life, slips of the tongue, and similar kinds of things. And then he also laid the foundations for psychotherapy, discovered the technique of free associations, the dynamics of transference analysis, and so on. A major pioneering effort. And his work inspired many other people. First, a small circle of researchers in his so-called Viennese circle, and then there's hundreds of professionals all over the world. And the combined effort of these people laid a foundation of quite comprehensive understanding of emotional and psychosomatic disorders, at least those that don't have any clear biological or organic basis. Now, the essence of Freud's approach to this problem of psychopathology was to link different types of disorders to disturbances of the development of the sexual drive, of the libidinal drive, and also the development of object relations, where the idea is that at the beginning the little infant is kind of in love with itself, and then gradually kind of attaches the libido to figures from his or her environment, the mother, the father, the siblings, and then a larger society. Freud's major discovery was described in his book, 3 Contributions to Sexual Theory, where he emphasized the fact that sexuality doesn't begin in puberty, that it actually begins very early in the nursing infant, where the oral zone is the primary libidinal zone, that the emphasis then shifts later during the time of the toilet training at the age of maybe 2-3 to the anal zone, then from there to the urethral zone, still related to the process of toilet training. And then around the age of 4, the attention and the emphasis shifts to the penis and to the clitoris. This is what Freud called the phallic stage. Now, according to him, when there is in any of these stages some problem, which could be actually overindulgence in the libidinal satisfaction, or the opposite, which is some kind of frustration of the libidinal drives, it creates what he called fixation, some kind of increased energetic charge in that area, which on the one hand interferes with further development because part of the energy remains kind of arrested in an earlier stage. But on the other hand, also a point of possible regression, so that when in the future the individual run into some problems, the libidinal energy would regress and flow back to the area of major fixation.